Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 203 of the podcast for June 23rd, 2014. My guest today is Christopher Gerry. Chris is founder of the Emily Gerry Foundation, and you may have read about this on my blog previously. The foundation was created, sadly, in the aftermath of the tragic death of Emily Gerry, Chris's daughter, a few years back. A preventable medical error that was caused by a number of factors and bad systems. And Chris, I really admire that he's been able to channel his emotions in the aftermath of losing his little girl into this advocacy for others, creating a foundation, telling a story, and I think more importantly, emphasizing the need to not just blame and punish individuals, but to focus on improving systems, improving processes, that's the best way of protecting other patients, and doing so as a way of honoring Emily and her tragically short life and her memory. So this is going to be a multiple-part podcast series. In this first part today, we really don't get beyond the story of what happened and the reactions and the aftermath to that. I'm going to do either one or two more parts, taking the remaining of the audio and the rest of our discussion, release that as one or two more podcasts, depending on how that divides up. But certainly encourage you to go to leanblog.org/203. You can find links to the foundation website. You can read more background, see some videos of Chris and Eric Kropp, the pharmacist, who was blamed and punished and convicted and jailed for his part or for being there when this tragedy occurred. And it's a gripping story. I hope you find it interesting and inspiring, and that you'll want to do more to help, whether that means helping the foundation or helping share Chris's work and story. This is powerful stuff. So thank you for listening. And if you want to subscribe and make sure you learn about the future episodes, you can go to leancast.org. Well, Chris, hi. Thanks so much for being a guest on the podcast to talk about this incredibly important topic today. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mark. I really do appreciate the amazing work that you're doing in the area of lean and how it can positively affect these issues relating to preventable medical error and drive things forward in a very positive way.
Well, thanks, and you're too kind. But there's so many of us in the lean community who are trying to help people improve quality and patient safety. A lot of inspiration comes from stories like yours and Emily's. For those of us who haven't been touched directly ourselves or our families by preventable medical error. So I appreciate you sharing your story and working so hard to be able to help others. And maybe if you can start off for our listeners, a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with your story and Emily's story. If you wouldn't mind, maybe just starting off by telling that to folks.
Definitely. My name is Chris Gerry. I'm a very, very proud father of three amazing children. And, I know I'm stating the obvious here, Mark, but I'm one of those individuals that believes every child born into this world is truly a miracle. And they all deserve to be treated as such, And with that said, though, my other two children, Nate and Catherine, are just incredible blessings. And so, but what I want to say, without showing my other children any other children for that matter, any disrespect, is the fact that Emily from the day she was born, Mark, seemed a little different than my other two. She was different in the sense that she seemed to be right from the start. I don't know how else to describe it other than to say her mother and I used to refer to Emily as being kind of an old soul. She seemed to know a little bit more than my other children did, and she was unique in the other sense that she was always so happy. She didn't fuss like normal children do. You couldn't be sad around Emily for more than a nanosecond or two. We could be upset as a family about something, and Emily would come strolling into the room just like laughing and giggling and what have you. And all of a sudden, your biggest problems as a family seem so minuscule. And it just seemed to be a gift of hers. And she had a very vibrant spirit is what I'm trying to express, and very, very energetic. And during the summer of 2005, Mark, Emily was playing out in the backyard with her big brother and big sister, Nate and Catherine, and they're running around. A beautiful late summer day, and every once in a while, as I'm watching them from the upper deck run around the backyard and play around on the swing set and things like that, I noticed Emily every once in a while would stop and grab her side and wince in pain. And again, being the strong little girl she was, that would last all of a nanosecond, and she'd be right back to doing what she was doing, right? And maybe because she was our third child, Mark, with your first baby, you worry about every little sniffle and sneeze, and you think, okay, my son just sneezed, I got to run him to the ER. He's got some horrible virus or something. You're a little paranoid with your first. With Emily, I wasn't too worried about it. I just witnessed this happen maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of an afternoon. And I thought to myself, there's something going on there. She's showing, as though she's a little uncomfortable, in a little bit of pain every once in a while. And I discussed it with Emily's mother, and we both thought, okay, the next day we're going to take her over to a leading pediatric hospital here in Cleveland, just to have it checked out, and just to try to find the source of Emily's discomfort. We brought her in, Mark, in the early fall of 2005 to have her checked out, and they decided to run Emily through the MRI to see what was going on. And my whole career had been spent in medical imaging, working with the manufacturers of those things. And, so naturally I'm thinking to myself, well, boy, that sounds like the most reasonable, course of treatment right now to try and find out, what the source of the problem is. They run her through the MRI. They did that, and lo and behold, it was discovered that Emily had a grapefruit-sized mass growing very rapidly in her abdomen. It was the most shocking news that any parent could ever imagine, especially when little Emily, on the outwardly, didn't appear to be sick in any way, shape, or form. She looked to be a completely healthy little girl. And the decision was made pretty much immediately that the course of treatment for Emily, they assured Emily's mother and I that this was even though it was so large, it was very treatable. It was very similar to a yolk sac tumor. And they told us that we would need to bring Emily in for about 3 days each month for routine chemotherapy. And then after 5 or 6 months of treatment, that Emily would probably need to have surgery to remove any residual scar tissue that would remain from a tumor with that type of size. And so we embarked as a family on this very scary road. And the pediatric oncology team set our expectations as Emily's parents as to what to expect. They told us, little Emily is going to lose all of her beautiful blonde ringlets of hair. She's going to lose a significant amount of weight. She's going to, especially right after the 3-day rounds, she's going to be exhibiting flu-like symptoms. She's going to be vomiting and all of that. But not to worry, because that is just going to be a very good sign that the tumor is actually responding to the chemotherapy. So mentally, Emily's mother and I, move forward with those kind of expectations. Mark, we brought Emily home from her first 3-day round of treatment, and I'm going to take little Emily out of her car seat at the top of our driveway and bring her inside. And as soon as I take her out of her car seat, that little girl's running towards the darn swing set immediately. What toddler wouldn't after being cooped up in the hospital, right? My point is I don't think, and I know I'm bragging a little bit here, Mark, but I think it's warranted. I don't think that my little girl Emily vomited one time after a chemotherapy regimen. She didn't start to lose her beautiful blonde ringlets of hair until about January of 2006. And I'm very proud to say I was told by her pediatric oncology team that, and this is at a facility that has roughly 450 beds, so a pretty large children's hospital. I was told that Emily was their first pediatric oncology patient that actually didn't lose any weight during the course of her treatment. My little girl somehow, some way, actually gained a pound during the course of treatment. So naturally, January, February rolls around. During her treatment, I started to think to myself, based on what I had been told previously, I started to think to myself, well, maybe that tumor is not responding to the chemotherapy treatment. And Emily's oncology team kind of thought the same thing. So they run her through the MRI again in the beginning of February of 2006. And lo and behold, their words, not mine, Mark, a miracle had occurred. That miracle that had occurred was that not only had the tumor completely and totally disappeared, but there wasn't even any residual scar tissue remaining from that tumor, from that mass being so large. And we were all elated. I mean, that's the kind of miraculous outcome, again, their words, not mine, that I would think every caregiver that gets involved in a career in healthcare would want to experience at least once or twice during the course of their lengthy careers. And her oncology team, I mean, everybody at this facility, Mark, I have to say to our listeners that every caregiver, and I told you what kind of background I came from. My whole career was spent being on the business side of medical imaging and being in and out of hospitals throughout Europe and some in the Middle East and things like that. My expectations when Emily was first diagnosed were probably a little higher and kind of a little on the obnoxious side.
Mm-hmm. And
when it came to what kind of expectations I had for the care that my daughter was going to receive when we started the treatment. And I have to say, and this is why I consider myself a very proud patient safety and caregiver advocate, it's because every caregiver that came in contact with my daughter from day one loved my little girl up like she was their own.
Right.
And exceeded my very high expectations for the care that my little girl was going to receive. And that's why I think ultimately that's in large part why I think my daughter had overcome this horrible affliction.
And I think we're all. I think we're in agreement. A lot of the listeners would agree. As you talk about what then happened, that none of this is a quote unquote bad apple problem. I appreciate
Precisely.
that you're expressing your gratitude and respect for all the great individuals who were involved in that care. Right.
Well, yes, and Mark, to speak to what you just said, what I'm trying to do is paint the picture here, because everybody was so elated. Not only we as parents and as an extended family were happy with this outcome, the caregivers all were very proud, as they should have been, of what had been accomplished with little Emily. And so I'll never forget, Mark, that Emily's mother and I are seated then with the oncology team after they ran her through the MRI in the beginning of February, and they're all happy as can be, and all of a sudden, I initially, when you're given that kind of news, I'm thinking, okay, well, we can dress my little girl up and bring her home. And they all immediately said to Kelly's mother and I, well, we're going to recommend, this is happy. You guys can begin your plans for taking the family to Disney World and things of that nature to celebrate Emily's recovery. But we're going to recommend one final 3-day round of chemotherapy just to make certain, absolutely 100% certain, that there are no residual cancer cells remaining in little Emily's body that could pop up later in life and cause her difficulty. And so naturally, Emily's mother and I agreed to do that. We brought Emily in because we wanted to get this put behind us and move on as a family. We decided to bring Emily in on February 24th of 2006, which was a Friday. And that happened to be Emily's second birthday. I couldn't think to myself of a better birthday present to any child than knowing in the back of my mind, I'm going to be bringing her home cured. And so we actually celebrated Emily's birthday at the medical facility that Friday. And we actually brought in cupcakes and what have you. And by now, word had traveled throughout this 450-bed facility to the other floors and things, to all the caregivers and what have you, about Emily's miraculous recovery. And Mark, I in my younger years, when I used to go to them, I swear I used to see shorter beer lines at rock concerts. With respect to all the caregivers from these other floors that had never met Emily, that wanted to come down and say happy birthday to her and, give her small, birthday cards and little gifts and treats and just kind of spoil her up a little bit. So it was amazing. And everything went well later that day with Emily's first day of her last 3 of the chemotherapy regimen. Everything went fine. And then on Saturday, everything went fine as well. And on Sunday, Mark, is when the nightmare began to unfold. I had arrived. I was taking care of my other 2 children at home, and I had arrived at the medical facility about 10 or 15 minutes after they had started Emily's IV. And when I walked into the treatment room that day, my wife was holding Emily unconscious in her arms. And I looked at her, and I still remember this, Mark, in very slow motion, because it was just so shocking that, I looked at my former wife, looked her in the eyes, and I said, what's going on? What's wrong with Emily? And she just gave me this blank stare and kind of shook her head, and I saw just total fear in her eyes. And I say I remember it in slow motion because it seemed like it was forever, but in that same fraction of a second, immediately all the alarms were going off, and then the nursing staff and the physicians and everybody were rushing in to the room. We all took Emily from Kelly's arms and put her on a gurney together, and everybody's trying to figure out why did her condition deteriorate so quickly. And they're trying to stabilize her, and they obviously shut off the IV, and we're trying to get Emily to regain consciousness. And we all rushed Emily down to the PICU, the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, which was on the same floor as Emily's treatment room. And they subsequently induced Emily into a coma. And as the doctors and specialists are trying to assess what had happened to Emily, I was just sitting there with Emily's mother trying to figure out, what the heck happened here? I mean, she was just fine a day or two ago, and now my little girl's in your PICU and induced into a coma. And it's not rocket science, Mark, but I came to the conclusion rather quickly that it had to be something relating to Emily's IV admixture. Had to be. And so I couldn't sit still for very long. I immediately went back to Emily's treatment room. And I had a nurse with me, and I immediately started digging through the trash to find Emily's partially full bag. And I did that, and I had the nurse call down for a hospital administrator, and I said, please call an administrator. And she did, and the administrator came up, and I handed her the bag, and I said to her, I really truly believe this is where you need to start your investigation. This has to be the reason my little girl is down in your PICU. It has to be. And so that's kind of where it started. And
did that administrator respond? I mean, did they respond, in a way that took that seriously? Did they?
Yes,
they did listen to that.
I have to say, Mark, they did take it very, very seriously, and I get asked this question often. I'm a big proponent of transparency when these things occur, and to be honest and forthright with people, especially when it comes to their loved ones. And a lot of people ask me then subsequently, well, do you feel the facility was being transparent with you because they felt that you found the smoking gun? That you, just because you dug through the trash and found that partially full bag? And Mark, I'm of the attitude, I'm always the optimist. I believe this facility was very, very transparent with Emily's mother and I, with their root cause analysis and what had happened and what have you, because it was the right thing to do, because they knew they had to do it. I'd like to think that it's not just because I handed them that partially full bag. Okay? And that's the walk that they seem to be walking now going forward years after Emily has passed. And so I'm very proud of them about that fact. So anyway, they started the investigation, and they found out what had happened, Mark, was that a pharmacy technician who didn't have the proper training or core competency, and we'll go into that in a little bit, the clinical pharmacy had been out of standard bags of saline with 0.9% sodium chloride. And in being out of standard bags of saline, the pharmacy technician who was on duty at that time thought that she was doing the right thing, and I really believe that she did think she was doing the right thing. She saw 3 vials of what's called hypertonic saline, which has 23.4% sodium chloride in concentration, which is just meant for small boluses or amounts to be added to people, I guess, that are a little bit dehydrated, that need electrolyte replacement and things of that nature. So she sees these 3 vials, and she thought she was doing the right thing. She grabs an empty compounding bag and then manually extracts these 3 vials of hypertonic saline, 23.4% concentration, and fills the bag full of this hypertonic saline, and then added Emily's chemotherapy agent to that. She even made the mistake of, as I understand it from talking with Eric Kropp, the pharmacist involved, that she had hand-labeled that bag with 0.9% sodium chloride, the correct concentration, which is why Eric signed off on it that day. And it gets sent up to Emily's room. And the reason Emily was unconscious when I arrived at the hospital 10 or 15 minutes after they started the IV was because when somebody is overdosed on something as simple as a common electrolyte like sodium chloride, salt, it causes immediate cerebral edema or brain swelling. So Emily had actually gone unconscious, passed out due to the pain that was involved. Not to paint an even more tragic picture, but I want our listeners to know what happens.
Mm-hmm. If anyone would think, oh, it's just saline, no, that has horrible consequences.
Yes, as does in fact, sodium chloride is what I've learned since I began doing this work in patient safety and working with groups like the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, ISMP, and the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. From the pharmacy experts, what I've learned is that common electrolytes like sodium chloride, salt, things like potassium, they're considered in the clinical pharmacy, they're considered high risk, very high risk medications that need to be kept under lock and key. Because things like potassium is what is used, I guess when they're doing capital punishment, where they're executing somebody, they use potassium to stop, a convicted person's heart. So in high concentrations, it can really, if accidentally given to a patient in too high of a concentration, these are medications that actually can really, really harm people.
And in the course of that happening, I was jotting some things down here, at least 4 different things that I would consider systemic errors. You mentioned the lack of training and credentialing, being stocked out of the standard bag of saline.
Yes.
Thinking she was doing the right thing. That kind of points to either again, lack of training, lack of supervision, lack of a culture where people can speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, we don't have the right bag. What do you expect me to do? The labeling error. Seems like just a litany
of systemic
errors.
Correct. And you were spot on there, Mark, because what I was horrified to find out, a few weeks later is when the root cause analysis study was a very comprehensive one, was completed, and the facility sat down with Emily's mother and I, and were very transparent about exactly what had happened. first and foremost, I have to say before I go there, 3 days after Emily was overdosed and induced into coma after multiple EEGs showed little to no brain activity, Emily's mother and I had to make the worst decision of our lives, which was one that I hope none of our listeners ever have to make for any of their loved ones. But we had to make the decision to take Emily off of life support. And that day, and Mark, I know you've seen some of the videos and some of my presentations, but it's true. That day was the only time in my life that I had contemplated doing something incredibly stupid, which was I had been loading some of Emily's personal belongings into our SUV that day, which was parked on the top floor of the parking garage. And I saw Emily's car seat in that car as I'm loading her things, just so confused and so emotionally traumatized as her father, thinking to myself, hey, I was supposed to be taking my little girl home today. And now I'm not. Now she's my little girl's going to the morgue. I didn't understand. And it was at that moment that I felt it was by the grace of God and by my little girl's spirit that they were hitting the pause button for a moment. And all of a sudden I started thinking rationally for a second, because I was thinking, Mark, maybe I should go take a flying leap, go join my little girl. And all of a sudden it was like, no, you need to find out, Daddy, you need to get to the bottom of this. What set these wonderful caregivers up to fail me? And you got to make sure that those systems and things are modified accordingly so that it doesn't happen to other people. So it was like at that point, Mark, a lot of people ask me, and I think this is very important. A lot of people ask me, Chris, when did you decide that this was going to be your calling? This was going to be your life's work. This is what you were going to do. It was kind of at that point. I knew immediately that this was the work that needed to be done. So after we had the root cause analysis with the facility, where they were very open and transparent with us, told us it was a pharmacy technician error, naturally my next question in my mind was, well, wait a minute here. I would think that going into any major medical facility that is going to be giving you IV medications, which is most all of them when you go in for care, because a lot of times they'll give you medications just to keep you hydrated and what have you. I started researching immediately. I thought it would be a pharmacist that would be compounding everything going right into someone's circulatory system.
Right. Well, and let me ask one other question. I mean, when you talk about the root cause analysis, did the hospital show an appreciation for the systemic factors, including, if I remember correctly, there was discussion of being overworked, understaffed, other issues? Did they have an appreciation for that, or did they say, well, that person made a mistake, or was it all of that?
It was kind of all of it together. They were all shocked themselves. They were all shocked themselves, and Mark, I think that goes back to the kind of the human nature side of things. Whether they said it or not, they did kind of point the finger initially. Okay, they pointed the finger when they immediately, and I didn't find out about this till afterwards, but I'd always wondered in my mind, why didn't the pharmacy director or the pharmacist that was involved, that signed off on it, why wouldn't him and anybody else immediately come up to the PICU that day and just say, hey, we're sorry, we're looking into this. We don't know what happened yet, but we're looking into this, and we're also, deeply disturbed by the whole thing. And that never happened. And I never realized this. But one of the ways that they pointed the fingers, whether they said they did or they didn't, was by just like 2 days later, they called Eric Kropp, and they called the pharmacy technician and asked them to come in.
And Eric was the pharmacist.
Yes, Eric was the
signed
pharmacist
off. Yeah.
involved, and Katie Dudash was the pharmacy technician involved. And they call them in, and immediately they fired them, both, and just told them to get their things and leave.
Was this before the root cause analysis was done?
Yes.
Yeah, because it probably wouldn't get done in 2 days.
Right. And then, the way that Eric had to learn about Emily's death was by one of his colleagues calling him up after he had been fired and saying, little Emily's passed away. Imagine how traumatic that is for them, being the second victims. To have to learn of it that way, but to also initially have the finger pointed at you. I mean, here you're being fired. That's before root cause analysis has even been done. And I believe that it's because the facility may not have had, I believe that they didn't have anything that even looked like what are called, the just culture principles that you and I are big proponents of.
Right.
In place. They didn't know how to respond.
Well, I think it's tempting, you talk about human nature, not just to blame, but to say, well, we took action. We held someone accountable. We fired 2 people.
Precisely.
And that even to, public perception, or a lot of people who don't think about the systemic causes of problems, that sound, well, you did something. Or,
Right. You responded to it. And I think it's human nature. I think all of us, when something horrible happens, something tragic happens, I think it's part of human nature and part of the human condition to almost, at least for a short period of time, for all of us to think to ourselves, no matter how rational you may be, to think to ourselves for a moment at least, who is, pardon my expression, Mark, but who is the SOB responsible? And who is that person? We need to find this culprit. And I think it's part of human nature to kind of think to yourself in the back of your mind, not only do we need to find this person and associate blame, but we need to effectively have a public lynching somehow, some way. And that's exactly how I view things, in terms of how they happen with the pharmacist that was involved, Eric Kropp. And when in fact we find out that, and I think this is what separates people when these tragedies occur, is how long do you have those thoughts for? Because if you follow through and you do have the public lynching and you do associate the blame even after root cause analysis has identified multiple system failures and processes and protocol failures, if we associate the blame with one individual and you have follow through and you have that public lynching, is anyone being made any safer? Are those systems and processes being modified accordingly so that those same errors don't happen over and over again?
Well, so that was part 1 of my discussion with Chris Jerry. I hope you'll come back and hear the remaining part of the discussion. You can go to leancast.org if you'd like to subscribe, or you can go to leanblog.org. You can sign up for email notifications of new blog posts, including these podcasts. To hear the rest of the story, where we're going to talk more about what's happening in the patient safety movement, what the foundation is doing, what people like Chris are doing to try to help prevent tragedies like this from occurring with other families and other children. So thanks for listening. And again, you can go to leanblog.org/203 to find links to stories that you can read online, other videos, things like that, if you'd like to dig deeper into what's happening here. So again, thanks for taking time to listen.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.